The first bullets whistled across the pebbled beach as the sun barely crested the horizon on August 19th, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment pressed his face against the cold metal of the landing craft. Watching the French coastline of Dieppe emerge from the pre-dawn darkness like a death sentence written in concrete and steel, the gentle lapping of waves against the hull would be the last peaceful sound many of these men would ever hear. What began as Operation Jubilee, carefully orchestrated raid designed to test German coastal defenses and boost Allied morale, was already unraveling before the first boot touched French soil. The convoy of ships carrying over 6,000 Allied troops, predominantly Canadian forces, had been spotted by German patrol boats hours earlier. The element of surprise crucial to the mission's success had vanished like smoke in the channel. Major General John Hamilton Roberts, commanding the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division from his headquarters ship, received the first ominous reports as his forces approached the heavily fortified port town. Intelligence had painted a picture of moderate German resistance, but the reality greeting his men was a fortress bristling with machine gun nests, artillery positions, and concrete bunkers that had been reinforced throughout the German occupation. Of France, the plan itself bore the hallmarks of desperate ambition. Churchill's government, under immense pressure from Stalin to open a second front in Europe and facing mounting criticism for military setbacks across multiple theaters, had approved this large-scale amphibious assault despite significant concerns. From military planners, the raid was intended to capture the port of Dieppe, hold it for several hours while gathering intelligence and destroying German installations, then withdraw before enemy reinforcements could arrive. As reported in various historical accounts, including those documented by the Canadian War Museum, the operation represented one of the most controversial Allied military actions of the Second World War. The German defenders, members of the 302nd Infantry Division under Colonel General Konrad von Rundstedt's Atlantic Wall fortification system, had transformed Dieppe into a killing ground perfectly designed to repel exactly this type of frontal assault. Captain Roy Murray of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry watched through his binoculars as the lead assault craft approached the main beach. The town's distinctive white cliffs rose on either side of the harbor like the walls of an amphitheater, and from every visible position, German weapons were already beginning to traverse toward the incoming Allied forces. The preliminary naval bombardment had been deliberately light to maintain the fiction of surprise, but now that deception would cost lives measured not in dozens, but in hundreds. The Canadian soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time, had trained extensively for this moment throughout the summer of 1942. They carried with them not just weapons and equipment, but the hopes of a nation eager to prove itself in the global struggle against fascism. The 2nd Canadian Corps had been stationed in Britain for nearly 3 years. Their government had been pressing for more aggressive deployment of Canadian forces in active combat roles. As the landing craft pushed through the increasingly choppy waters of the English Channel, the men inside could hear the growing intensity of German defensive fire. The sound started as distant popping, like firecrackers at a celebration, but rapidly grew into the distinctive chatter of machine guns and the deeper boom of artillery pieces finding their range. The ramp of landing craft, Tank 57, dropped, with a metallic clang that was immediately drowned by the screaming of machine gun bullets tearing through the morning air. Private John Foote of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry was among the first to leap onto what would become known as the Red Beach, and within seconds, he understood that everything had gone catastrophically wrong. The beach at Dieppe was not the sandy approach that planners had envisioned, but a steep slope of loose stones that made movement slow and treacherous. Worse, the German defenders had positioned their weapons with scientific precision to create interlocking fields of fire that swept every inch of the landing zone. The distinctive rattle of the German MG-42 machine guns created a deadly the symphony that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Colonel Dollard Menard, commanding the Fusiliers Montreuil, watched in horror as his men were cut down before they could advance 50 yards from the water's edge. The German positions, dug deep into the cliffs overlooking the beach, had been constructed over 2 years of occupation. Every bunker, every gun emplacement, every strand of barbed wire had been positioned with the specific purpose of repelling an amphibious assault. The tanks of the Calgary Regiment, specially modified Churchill tanks designed to support the infantry advance, became death traps as they bogged down in the loose shingle. Tank Commander Sergeant Leo Leckie found his vehicle immobilized within minutes of landing, its tracks spinning uselessly in the unstable surface while German anti-tank guns methodically destroyed one armored vehicle after another. The tanks that did manage to move forward discovered that the concrete barriers and steel obstacles placed throughout the town made further advance impossible. Meanwhile, on the flanks of the main assault, the subsidiary attacks were meeting similar fates. At Puys, east of the main beach, the Royal Regiment of Canada faced a nightmare scenario as their landing craft arrived 30 minutes behind schedule, eliminating any hope of surprising the defenders. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Caddo led his men up a narrow gully that had been transformed into a perfectly prepared killing ground, with German machine gun positions commanding every approach, according to historical documentation preserved in British military archives. The German 4th Company of the 571st Regiment had been conducting regular defensive exercises at this exact location for months. When the Canadian forces appeared, the defenders simply executed their well-rehearsed plans with devastating efficiency. Captain Dennis Whitaker of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry managed to lead a small group of men across the deadly beach and into the town itself, where they engaged in fierce house-to-house fighting with German defenders. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the raid might achieve some of its objectives. But these isolated pockets of success were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer weight of German defensive fire. The Royal Air Force, which had promised massive air support for the operation, found itself engaged in fierce aerial combat with the German Luftwaffe. Wing Commander Douglas Bader, leading Fighter Command operations over Dieppe, discovered that the Germans had positioned their aircraft to respond rapidly to any Allied air activity. Promised air superiority never materialized, leaving the ground forces exposed to German aircraft that strafed the beaches with impunity by 8 o'clock in the morning. Barely 2 hours after the initial landings, it had become clear to commanders aboard the headquarters ships that the raid was turning into an unmitigated disaster. The radio communications from the beach painted a picture of carnage and confusion, with unit after unit reporting heavy casualties and inability to advance beyond the immediate landing areas. Major General Roberts faced an agonizing decision. The original plan called for the raiding force to hold their positions until early afternoon before beginning withdrawal. But continuing the operation would only result in the complete destruction of the attacking forces. Preliminary reports indicated casualty rates that were unprecedented in any previous Allied operation. Through the chaos and carnage of the disintegrating assault, individual acts of extraordinary courage began to emerge like beacons in the darkness of military disaster. Captain John Foote, the chaplain of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, moved across the bullet-swept beach without regard for his own safety, dragging wounded men to whatever shelter could be found among the scattered rocks and abandoned equipment. German defenders, members of the battle-hardened 302nd Infantry Division, had positioned their weapons with mathematical precision. Major Wilhelm Harman, commanding the coastal battery at Berneval, coordinated his artillery fire with deadly accuracy, turning the approaching landing craft into floating coffins before they could reach the shore. His guns, protected by thick concrete casemates, fired salvo after salvo into the packed formations of Allied vessels at Varangeville. However, the story unfolded differently. Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovett's No. 4 Commando executed a textbook assault on the German coastal battery, approaching through the wooded ravines that intelligence had correctly identified as the weak point in the defensive system. His men, veterans of previous commando raids, moved with silent precision through the pre-dawn darkness. Avoiding the German sentries and reaching their objective undetected, the commando's success at Varangeville represented the only clear of the entire operation, using Bangalore torpedoes to breach the wire obstacles and coordinated small unit tactics. They overwhelmed the German gun crews and completely destroyed the battery that had been designated as their primary target. Lovett's men demonstrated that, with proper intelligence, adequate preparation, and realistic objectives. Amphibious operations could succeed even against well-prepared defenders. Back on the main beach, the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment earned the Victoria Cross for his leadership in the face of impossible odds. Repeatedly crossing a heavily defended bridge while under intense machine gun fire to rally his scattered men. His famous call of "Come on over, there's nothing to it," became legendary. Though the reality was that German defenders were systematically destroying every Allied attempt to advance inland. The German machine gunners, positioned in concrete bunkers with overlapping fields of fire, maintained a rate of fire that made movement across the open beach virtually suicidal. Obergefreiter Heinrich Windisch of the 617th Regiment later described the scene as resembling a training exercise, with Allied soldiers presenting themselves as perfect targets against the white stones of the beach as historical. Records from the German Federal Archives indicate the defenders had been expecting an Allied raid for months. The systematic reinforcement of coastal positions, the careful positioning of reserves, and the coordination between different defensive units had transformed Dieppe into a model of German defensive doctrine. Tank Sergeant Leo Leckie, whose Churchill tank had become immobilized in the shingle, continued to fight from his stationary position, using his tank's guns to support the infantry advance until German anti-tank weapons finally knocked out his vehicle. The modified tanks, equipped with flamethrowers and special engineering equipment, proved unable to cope with the unexpected terrain conditions and the intensity of German defensive fire. Captain Roy Murray led repeated attempts to establish a foothold in the town itself, but German snipers and machine gun teams positioned in the upper floors of buildings commanded every street and intersection. The urban combat devolved into a series of desperate firefights in which Allied forces, lacking proper street fighting training and equipment, found themselves at a severe disadvantage. By mid-morning, the accumulation of individual heroic actions could not overcome the fundamental flaws in the operational plan. The beach was littered with destroyed equipment, abandoned weapons, and the bodies of men who had volunteered for what they believed would be a bold stroke against the German occupation of Europe. The German defenders, despite their tactical success, recognized the courage of their opponents. Multiple German after-action reports noted the determination and bravery of the Allied forces. Even as they documented the devastating effectiveness of their own defensive preparations, at 11:15 on the morning of August 19th, Major General John Hamilton Roberts made the most difficult decision of his military career. From the bridge of the headquarters destroyer, HMS Culpe, he could see the smoke rising from the beaches of Dieppe and hear the continuous rattle of gunfire. That indicated his forces were still engaged in a desperate struggle for survival. The radio reports from the beach commanders painted a picture of complete tactical failure. But Roberts faced an even more agonizing reality: how to extract the survivors without sacrificing the naval forces that would be needed for future operations. Withdrawal operation, designated as the emergency evacuation phase of Operation Jubilee, required the landing craft to return to beaches that were now completely dominated by German fire. The original plan had assumed that Allied forces would control the harbor and be able to embark from the relative safety of the port facilities. But German resistance had prevented any meaningful penetration beyond the immediate beach areas. Commander Hugh Wallace, leading the flotilla of landing craft assigned to the evacuation, understood that his vessels were essentially sailing into a carefully prepared trap. The German artillery positions, which had been targeting the landing zones for hours, had now ranged in perfectly on the evacuation points. Every approach to the beach was covered by multiple weapon systems that could destroy landing craft before they could take on survivors. Lieutenant Colonel Dollard Menard, commanding the Fusiliers Montreuil, had been severely wounded early in the assault but continued to coordinate his unit's defensive positions from a makeshift command post in a damaged building near the beach. His men, scattered in small groups throughout the lower town, faced the impossible task of holding their positions against overwhelming German counterattacks while simultaneously preparing for evacuation. The German response to the evacuation attempt demonstrated the professional competence of their coastal defense system. Major Hans Loff, coordinating the artillery response from his command bunker, concentrated fire on the offshore areas where the landing craft were forced to approach, creating a barrier of exploding shells that few Allied vessels could penetrate. According to wartime correspondence preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, the evacuation phase represented one of the most harrowing experiences in the history of amphibious warfare. The combination of accurate artillery fire, machine gun positions with clear fields of fire, and the physical constraints of the beach itself created conditions that made rescue operations extremely hazardous. Captain Dennis Whitaker, who had led one of the few successful penetrations into the town, found himself trapped with a handful of men in a position that could not be reached by the evacuation craft. German infantry, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, had systematically reduced the Allied perimeter until only isolated pockets of resistance remained. The Royal Navy crews manning the landing craft displayed extraordinary courage in their attempts to reach the survivors. Sub-Lieutenant Peter Scott, commanding Landing Craft Personnel 127, made repeated runs through the German fire zone, each time managing to embark small groups of wounded and exhausted soldiers before being forced back by the intensity of the defensive barrage. The Luftwaffe, which had been conspicuously absent during the initial landings, arrived in force during the evacuation phase. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters and Junkers 88 bombers attacked the Allied naval forces, with devastating effect, sinking several landing craft and damaging multiple destroyers. The promised Royal Air Force air cover proved insufficient to protect the evacuation fleet from sustained German air attack. By early afternoon, it became clear that many of the men trapped on the beaches would not be rescued. The combination of German defensive fire, weather conditions that were deteriorating rapidly, and the simple mathematics of time and distance made further evacuation attempts suicidal. Roberts was forced to accept that hundreds of Allied soldiers would have to be left behind, either dead or destined for German prisoner of war camps. The final phase of the evacuation required individual acts of heroism from naval personnel who volunteered to make last-minute rescue attempts. Motor Launch De-62, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Rupert Curtis, made the final approach to the beach under intense fire, managing to embark the last group of survivors before German artillery made further rescue attempts. Impossible. As the last Allied landing craft disappeared beyond the horizon, the German defenders of Dieppe began the grim task of accounting for the aftermath of the failed raid. Colonel General Conrad von Rundstedt's Atlantic Wall had passed its first major test, but the beaches were littered with evidence of the human cost of military miscalculation. Over 1,900 Canadian soldiers found themselves prisoners of the German Wehrmacht, many of them wounded, and all of them facing an uncertain future in German captivity. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt, despite his heroic leadership during the battle, was among those captured when his positions became untenable. The German soldiers who took him prisoner recognized his Victoria Cross actions and treated him with the professional respect accorded to brave enemies Major Wilhelm Harman, whose artillery battery had played such a crucial role in the German defense, supervised the collection of Allied wounded and the processing of prisoners according to the Geneva Convention protocols. Despite the intensity of the fighting, both sides had maintained the military courtesies that distinguished professional soldiers from irregular fighters. The casualty figures that emerged from Operation Jubilee represented one of the most devastating single-day losses in Canadian military history. Of the 4,963 Canadian forces that participated in the raid, 3,367 became casualties, 907 were killed, 1,946 were captured, and the remainder were wounded but successfully evacuated. Captain John Foote, the chaplain whose courage on the beach had become legendary, made a decision that exemplified the moral complexity of military service. When offered the opportunity to evacuate with the wounded, he chose instead to remain with the men who were being taken prisoner, believing that his spiritual guidance would be needed more in German captivity than in the relative safety of England. The German medical personnel, led by Dr. Heinrich Müller of the 302nd Infantry Division Medical Corps, worked alongside captured Allied medics to treat the wounded from both sides. The field hospital established in the casino building treated over 200 wounded soldiers during the first 24 hours after the battle, demonstrating the professional medical standards maintained by German military physicians. As documented in post-war testimonies collected by the Canadian Department of Veterans Affairs, the treatment of Allied prisoners varied considerably depending on their captors and the circumstances of their capture. The regular Wehrmacht units generally observed international law regarding prisoners of war, but some Allied personnel reported harsh treatment during the initial processing phase. The psychological impact on the captured soldiers proved as significant as their physical wounds. Many had enlisted with high expectations of military glory and found themselves facing years of imprisonment without having achieved any meaningful military objective. Private James McCool of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry later wrote that the transition from combat to captivity occurred so rapidly that many prisoners experienced a form of psychological shock that persisted throughout their imprisonment. German intelligence officers led by Major Hans Gimpel of the Abwehr conducted extensive interrogations of the captured Allied personnel in an effort to understand the strategic objectives behind the raid. The prisoners, bound by military discipline and the code of conduct, provided only name, rank, and serial number, but German intelligence analysts were able to piece together significant information about Allied amphibious capabilities and planning processes. The wounded prisoners faced particular challenges, as German medical facilities were already stretched by casualties from the Eastern Front. Despite these limitations, captured Allied medical personnel, including Dr. John McCrae of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, reported that German military hospitals generally maintained professional medical standards and provided adequate care within the constraints of wartime resource limitations. The German propaganda apparatus, under the direction of Dr. Joseph Goebbels, seized upon the failed raid as evidence of Allied military incompetence and the futility of attempting to establish a second front in Europe. Photographs of captured Allied soldiers and destroyed equipment appeared in German newspapers throughout occupied Europe, intended to discourage resistance movements and demonstrate German military superiority. However, the German military leadership, including Colonel General von Rundstedt himself, recognized that the Dieppe raid represented a learning experience for Allied planners rather than a final defeat. Intelligence reports indicated that the Allies would apply the lessons learned from this failure to future amphibious operations, making subsequent attacks potentially more dangerous and better prepared in the months following the Dieppe disaster. Allied military planners conducted the most comprehensive analysis of amphibious warfare tactics in modern military history. The price of this education had been measured in thousands of casualties, but the knowledge gained would prove crucial to the success of future operations from North Africa to Normandy. General Bernard Law Montgomery, who had not been involved in the Dieppe planning but inherited responsibility for analyzing its failures, wrote extensively about the tactical and strategic errors that had doomed Operation Jubilee from its conception. His analysis, preserved in British military archives, identified fundamental flaws in intelligence gathering, objective selection, and force composition that had made success virtually impossible. The intelligence failure represented perhaps the most critical breakdown in the planning process. Allied reconnaissance had drastically underestimated both the strength of German fortifications and the competence of the defending forces. The 302nd Infantry Division, dismissed in pre-raid briefings as a second-rate coastal defense unit, had proven to be a well-trained and expertly led formation capable of conducting sophisticated defensive operations. Admiral Louis Mountbatten, who had championed the raid as head of combined operations, faced intense criticism from both military colleagues and political leaders. The post-operation analysis revealed that fundamental principles of amphibious warfare had been ignored in the rush to demonstrate Allied offensive capability. The lack of adequate naval gunfire support, insufficient air cover, and the decision to attempt a direct assault on a heavily fortified port represented a series of tactical errors that professional military analysis should have prevented. As documented in classified post-war studies released by the British National Archives, the Dieppe experience fundamentally changed Allied doctrine regarding amphibious operations. The concept of seizing a fortified port through direct assault was abandoned in favor of the artificial harbor technology that would prove crucial to the success of the Normandy invasion. Lieutenant General Henry Crere, commanding the 1st Canadian Army, supervised the integration of Dieppe survivors back into Canadian military units while simultaneously analyzing their combat reports for tactical intelligence. The detailed after-action reports provided by surviving officers and non-commissioned officers created the most comprehensive database of German defensive tactics available to Allied planners. The technological lessons proved as important as the tactical ones. The failure of the specially modified Churchill tanks demonstrated the need for better coordination between armor and infantry in amphibious operations. The difficulties experienced with radio communications under combat conditions led to significant improvements in military communication equipment and procedures. Wing Commander Douglas Batter's analysis of the air operations over Dieppe revealed critical deficiencies in air-ground coordination that would be addressed in subsequent operations. The German Luftwaffe's effective response to Allied air attacks demonstrated the need for more comprehensive air superiority before attempting major amphibious assaults. The medical lessons learned from treating casualties during the evacuation phase led to significant improvements in battlefield medicine and casualty evacuation procedures. Dr. James Robertson, Senior Medical Officer for the Canadian Forces at Dieppe, developed new techniques for treating combat wounds under fire that would save thousands of lives in later campaigns. Perhaps most importantly, the Dieppe experience convinced Allied leadership that successful amphibious operations required massive logistical support, extensive preliminary bombardment, and careful selection of assault objectives. The notion that surprise and audacity could substitute for overwhelming force was permanently discredited by the events of August 19th. 1940-2. General Dwight David Eisenhower, who would later command the Normandy invasion, studied the Dieppe reports extensively and incorporated their lessons into the planning for Operation Overlord. His staff developed detailed protocols for naval gunfire support, air cover, and logistics that directly addressed the failures identified in the Dieppe analysis. The German defensive success at Dieppe also influenced their subsequent coastal fortification efforts. Though this ultimately worked against German interests by encouraging overconfidence in static defensive systems, the belief that Allied amphibious capabilities had been definitively proven inadequate led to complacency in some sectors of the Atlantic Wall that would be exploited during the Normandy landings. 2 years after the disaster at Dieppe, the lessons learned from that bloody morning would prove their worth on the beaches of Normandy. As the massive Allied armada approached the coast of German-occupied France in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, many of the commanders and staff officers involved had studied every detail of the Dieppe failure and sworn that such mistakes would never be repeated. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group for Operation Overlord, had incorporated virtually every tactical lesson from Dieppe into his planning. The preliminary naval bombardment that had been woefully inadequate at Dieppe was replaced by the most massive artillery barrage in military history. 700 warships, including battleships carrying guns larger than any that had supported the Dieppe raid, pounded German positions for hours before the first landing craft approached the beaches. The artificial Mulberry harbors, perhaps the most innovative technological response to the Dieppe experience, eliminated the need to capture a fortified port through direct assault. These massive prefabricated harbor facilities, towed across the English Channel and assembled off the Normandy coast, provided the logistical capability that had been desperately lacking during the earlier raid. Major John Foote, the chaplain, who had chosen to remain with his captured men at Dieppe, was liberated from German captivity in May of 1945 and lived to see the ultimate vindication of the sacrifice made by Canadian forces. His Victoria Cross citation specifically noted that the courage displayed at Dieppe had contributed to the eventual success of Allied arms in Western Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt, another Dieppe veteran and Victoria Cross recipient, returned to Canadian service after his liberation and participated in the final campaigns against Germany. His leadership during the hopeless situation at Dieppe had demonstrated that individual courage could survive even the most catastrophic military failures, providing inspiration for subsequent operations. The German defenders of Dieppe, many of whom had been transferred to other sectors of the Atlantic Wall, found themselves facing a completely different type of Allied assault on D-Day. The lessons learned from their successful defense had been applied to German coastal fortification throughout occupied Europe. But the scale and sophistication of the Normandy invasion overwhelmed defensive preparations that had proven adequate. Against smaller-scale raids, Colonel General Conrad von Rundstedt, whose Atlantic Wall had successfully repelled the Dieppe raid, recognized that the Allied learning curve had ultimately favored the attackers. The temporary tactical victory achieved by German defenders in 1942 had provided the Allies with the knowledge needed to achieve strategic victory in 1940-4, as documented in post-war historical analyses preserved in military archives across multiple nations. The Dieppe raid represents one of military history's most expensive learning experiences. The immediate tactical failure had been transformed through careful analysis and systematic improvement into the foundation for later success. The Canadian military, which had borne the heaviest casualties at Dieppe, earned redemption through their performance during the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations in northwestern Europe. Units that had been devastated at Dieppe were rebuilt and retrained, incorporating the hard-won experience of their predecessors into new tactical doctrines that proved highly effective against German defensive positions. The broader strategic impact of the Dieppe raid extended beyond purely military considerations. The demonstration of Allied willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives convinced the German leadership that the war would continue regardless of temporary tactical defeats. The psychological impact of the raid on both sides contributed to the total war mentality that characterized the final years of the European conflict. In the final analysis, the 1,900 Canadian casualties at Dieppe had purchased knowledge that would save tens of thousands of Allied lives during subsequent amphibious operations. The transformation of tactical failure into strategic success through systematic learning and adaptation represents one of the finest examples of professional military education in modern warfare. The men who died on the beaches of Dieppe had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had taught the lessons that would ultimately lead to victory in the largest and most complex military operation in human history. The morning of August 19, 1942, had begun with hope and ended in disaster. The ultimate legacy of Operation Jubilee was written not in the casualty lists of that terrible day, but in the successful invasion of Normandy that followed 2 years later.